That was the signal. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to make some introductions in a moment, but first I want to dive right in. Who here has seen the Elgin Marbles in their current home, not a mile from here? Yes? Most people in this room. We can't find out. We're live as well, live streaming. It's difficult to see who online is doing that, but certainly a majority here. Who has seen the museum that has been built for them, the New Acropolis Museum in Greece? A much smaller number. Who would prefer them to be called the Parthenon sculptures?
Marbles.
Or marbles. Parthenon rather than Elgin. OK, last question. Who wrote the following words? The Elgin Marbles should leave this northern whiskey-drinking gilt culture and be displayed where they belong, in a country of bright sunshine and the landscape of Achilles, the shadowy mountains and the echoing sea. Who wrote those words? Exactly right. You knew that. As a student at Oxford in 1986. Well, look, our exam question is, should the UK return the Elgin Marbles? I'm Giles Whittell. I work here as an editor. I'm delighted that we're having this conversation, which, let's face it, has been had many times before, but for two reasons. One is, I think there's a sense that things are moving. Quite recently, a museum in Palermo allowed a very small fragment of the Parthenon marbles to return to Italy, and the idea is that that could become a permanent arrangement. In this country, in Bristol, in Oxford, we're confronting awkward questions about our own statuary and our own history, in some cases by pulling statues down and throwing them in rivers. And just on the more specific question of these sculptures and this government, last month, The Times, and I wouldn't ordinarily big up editorials in The Times, but changed its position after 50 years of consistent support for keeping them in the British Museum, and did a 180-degree volte-face, which was interpreted, rightly or wrongly, in Greece as a really significant sign that the British establishment was changing its mind on this question. And then I read at the end of a Guardian piece, no more significant, I don't think, but signs that they're even softening on the issue at the Daily Telegraph. And the did you see why? The reason for that, apparently, is that they realise they've been lied to by none other than Boris Johnson, who, in all his time as a columnist at the Telegraph, insisted that he had never supported the restitution of the marbles to Greece. And this old piece that he wrote in Oxford Student newspaper turns up showing that that was not the case. But the second reason that I think it's great that we're having this conversation is it's a perfect conversation for a ThinkIn. For many people on both sides of the argument, it's open and shut. For many people, there is space in the middle. But either way, there's plenty of room for civilized disagreement, and that is the point of this. So, as many of you will know, the idea is to pitch in. You can do so at any time. If you're online, I have instructions to keep an eye on that screen, which is a new development I'm very excited about, and to keep an eye on this. And I think I'm going to get some help with the chat, but please, if you're joining us online, dive in the chat. We have, returning to the newsroom, Agatha, marching across the screen there. When she gets to the right-hand side, time's up. And please, in the room, raise your hands at any point. But I want to start, please, with Dominic Selward, who's a barrister, historian, novelist. Dominic, you've done this before. Do it again. I think it will help to sort of set the parameters of the debate. Should the UK return the Elgin Marbles, and if not, why not?
I think, Charles, your opening remarks frame this really well, because that language of Boris Johnson's is what we're used to when we have this debate, which is very highly emotionally charged, very colourful, vivid, and it pulls us, makes us feel this yearning about these ancient sculptures and where they should be. And we get romantically seduced by a vision of what they have been and should be. We need to be a bit mindful of that, because actually there's a hard intellectual debate underneath it, and it's got a number of pillars to it. One of them is that we can't really think about the present and what we should do now unless we understand the past properly. And we don't understand the past properly. We quite often read, the marbles were stolen. Well, they weren't stolen. They've never been a legal case about them being stolen. We can have this discussion about the documentation, the legitimacy of Elgin's purchase of them, but they simply weren't stolen. So that's important, because when we say we should give them back because they're stolen, we're actually basing it on a false premise. So the first one is we do need to understand the past, and the past is always more complex and more nuanced than we think, or we have time for in a soundbite culture. The second thing is that we need to think about, why do we think returning and moving objects around the world is a good thing? Because we almost start this debate with the idea that, well, inherently it must be a good thing. Clearly it's the right thing to do. But is it? And why do we make that assumption? And when thinking about this and listening to all the debates, I realised that in many regards, although there is clearly a human and emotional pull to want to have objects from one's country around one, actually, taken to the extreme, it becomes nationalism. It becomes a kind of cultural nationalism. And I don't like nationalism. I don't think that's a nice thing. And if I think about objects, for example, near Tokyo, there's a museum where they have a vast amount of Beatles memorabilia, guitars, lyrics, costumes. One of the most important Bibles in the world, a Latin Bible. The first full, complete Latin Bible was made in England in Anglo-Saxon times. It's been in Italy for 1,000 years. The Bayeux Tapestry, made in England, been in France for ever since it was made. You know, should these things act and live and have their own lives? Do objects have lives, or do they have passports? And I just don't think they do. And I think that that's kind of a Disney-esque way of viewing the world, that something that was made somewhere has to belong there. Absolutely not. These things are ambassadors for the people who made them, to an extent for their countries. But if we weigh up the importance of someone feeling this should be in my country, together with, well, do we want a world of cultural nationalism? I think we don't. And then the last point I think that's important is, we really do have to think about what kind of museums do we want. Because these museums, which we're lucky enough to live in a country that has an amazing one, but many other countries are too, including Greece, where they have splendid museums, which also have artifacts from Egypt and other countries. These big international museums are educational in a way that their Enlightenment founders wanted them to be, and they're windows into a wider world. Whereas if we just have museums of our own culture, we're just looking at mirrors of ourselves and we're learning nothing. And I love that Enlightenment idea, that we can go into a building and we can see things from across time and across cultures and begin to put the human story together and see it in context. So those are the points that I'd make to start with. I think that there are really interesting questions in this debate which go far deeper and broader than Boris's or anyone else's language about seeing the marbles under the Hellenic sky and so on. That's romanticism. There are pragmatic things to this debate which I think shouldn't be forgotten.
Great, thank you, Dominic. We'll come in a little bit to Dr. Errol Francis of Culture but first, on my right, Vicky Price. You are an economist whose reputation as an economist precedes you. You've advised this government and others, I think. But you forgive me if I say that you're here tonight principally in your capacity as a Greek-born economist. And I didn't realise until I checked that you basically grew up in Greece. I mean, came here when you were 17. Dominic has set out some reasons why the Parthenon marbles should stay here. He says categorically that they're not stolen. That the notion of restitution could lead to cultural nationalism, and he articulated the idea of the Universal Museum as having intrinsic value by bringing artifacts from many cultures together in one place. That's all pretty compelling, isn't it?
I have actually debated with Dominic before. And in fact, we did something for Prospect magazine a few years ago, and we got everyone in the end to vote, and they voted to return them. But you could argue that this is very much, framed by the types of people who read Prospect magazine. But as we know, the population as a whole seems to be in favour of returning it too. The opinion polls that have been done now for a number of years suggest that this is the case, which is interesting in itself. So there is a group of people who seem to think that we should never return them because they belong to the British Museum, or they have not been stolen, or whatever. But I think the population, I think as you rightly said in your introduction, there has been a movement in this respect. I think people are a lot less, exercised by whether, things are in the British Museum or they go somewhere else where they belong. And I think it is an issue we still talk about, for example, the Elgin Marbles. That is, of course, to remind us that somebody called Elgin, Lord, actually took them. So bear that in mind. I mean, as Melina Mercouri said very clearly herself, who was the Minister of Culture, in addition to being an amazing actress, of course, she spoke at the Oxford Union herself a little while after, I would imagine, since it was in 86. Boris, a bit before? In 86? Well, they met, yes. It was a... Yeah, it was at the same event. Can't have been the same event. But anyway, it could well have been. She said at the time that there is no such thing as the Elgin Marbles. There is a Michelangelo David, there is a Da Vinci Last Supper, there is a Praxiteles Hermes, there is a Turner Fisherman at Sea. There are no Elgin Marbles. He didn't do them. He didn't make them. They have got nothing to do with him. And you could argue about whether they were stolen or not. I think if you look at the evidence, it suggests that there wasn't even a proper piece of paper allowing him to take the marbles away. And we're not talking about even taking whole bits away. Well, you could perhaps have forgiven that. You just took bits. I mean, in order to do that, he had to carve out bits from the marbles. So we have a bit of a torso here, a bit of a torso in Greece. So basically what you've done is we've taken bits away. And for some reason, we seem to think that those bits that we've taken away, or he's taken away, belong to whoever it is who took them away, which, as you know, there's been a lot of restitution that's taken place for anything that has been stolen before. And you could still argue about whether it was stolen or not. We can move away from that. But what has really happened is that things that were belonging to a particular place and were part of a structure have been cut up and taken away. And this whole idea that he was a lover of culture and therefore wanted to preserve it. Of course, he wanted to put it all in his house and demonstrate that he was such a great guy and perhaps make some money out of this. As we know, he was going through some terrible divorce, and in the end, he had to sell it at a loss to the British Museum, or to the government, rather, who then gave it to the British Museum. So there's still an issue about who owns them. Is this government? Is the British Museum? Why is the British Museum entitled to say we're not going to return it just because he has a board of trustees now run by George Osborne, of course, or chaired by George Osborne? So it's a very peculiar situation to find yourself in. But what is, I think, interesting and is that, you spoke about what Boris Johnson said, and of course we know that because it's now come out, and of course we should have been able to find out some time ago. But it's interesting to see what Christopher Hitchens wrote about this. And what interested me, because I looked at his book, which he had written originally in '87, called Imperial Spoils, which was all about why the Parthenon, or whatever he was calling them, the Elgin Marbles at the time should be. Then he updated that for another edition, where it was exactly the same book. It was called The Elgin Marbles, Why They Should Be Returned. And then the same book has reappeared with the title, The Parthenon Marbles. So you can just see the switch that is taking place. And I'll just read you, to finish, what he said about it, which I've written here in appalling handwriting, so I sincerely hope that I can actually read it. He said, the Parthenon sculpture is like a marvelous canvas arbitrarily torn across depth and perspective and proportion summarily, and that structure was basically abolished. So this is what's happened, and that is why they should be returned to be where they should be, reunited with the rest of what was built originally. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you very much. Let's ask Dr. Errol Francis now. You are Artistic Director and CEO of Culture and your position here is broadly as in favour of restitution. I'm interested to know specifically what you make of the slippery slope argument against restitution, but also if you can situate the whole argument in the zeitgeist, in what the change, as many people see it, that we're going through at the moment, yes, as we confront these questions about, yes, Colston, about roads, etc.
Yes, yes. Well, the zeitgeist is changing in a really exciting way, and there are people who are trying to resist this change. Going back to the points that Dominic made about emotion, let's start with some of the issues about emotion. It reminds me of the visit of the delegation of the Masai people to Oxford to talk about objects that had been taken from them in the 19th century. And what they said, I could never forget, they said that the museum should be a place of humanity, not just objects. And what that means is that Dominic's resistance to emotion actually should be challenged, because what is emerging with this zeitgeist is a new ethical framework about museums where people don't want to go to museums and look at human remains. That's being challenged. They also don't want to go to museums that are sponsored by companies that have dubious reputations in whether it's pharmacology or energy. And they don't want to go to museums and see objects that have been acquired by dubious means. Now, we don't have to use emotive words like stolen. We just have to say that the circumstances of their acquisition during a period when Greece was under occupation by a foreign power, that people are challenging that. So the present, when you talk about the present, Dominic, people are looking back to history and thinking, look, we cannot accept the circumstances in which these objects were acquired. So that's what's being challenged, and it's a very powerful movement, and I think it's going to change. It doesn't matter what this government says, it is going to change, it is changing. We've got museums that are returning things and making amends, actually, to the countries and people from where these objects originate. But I also want to go back to something that Vicky said about the look of these sculptures. I actually think that let's get away from the issues about ownership and so on, but as an artist, as someone who works in the art, I think that looking at that display is like looking at a series of amputated limbs. You know, not only the way that you described the removal, but they're part of a building. They're meant to be part of an architectural ensemble, and the display in the Devine Gallery is a fragmented series of pieces that don't actually allow you to appreciate. Well, you know, let's get away from the ownership thing. It's a weird display, actually. Right. And if nothing else, it should be dealt with. And I actually think that if they were returned, the British Museum would have a wonderful opportunity to actually have a display about the Parthenon, about the Acropolis, using the modern techniques we have, VR, artificial, you know, they could be so digital technology, there could be so many exciting ways that visitors could experience what that building was, what the Acropolis represents, and to learn from that. You don't need to have the object there. I think there's a kind of cult of authenticity, and the other point I want to make about nationalism, there is nothing more nationalistic than the British Museum. How can you know, this thing is a statement of British cultural and imperial superiority. I just don't see how you can, you know, say that somehow to deal with the return and proper contextualization of these objects, that somehow that is nationalistic. These imperial museums are de facto statements of nationalism.
Well, there's a lot there that I'd like to pick up on, but let's get the last point first. Dominic, what do you make of the Errol's last point, that in contrast to what you said, direct contrast, the BM is actually an expression of nationalism itself?
Yeah, I know that's a view. It's not one that I share, and I'll tell you why. Because the great encyclopedic museums were founded in the 1750s and 60s in London, in St. Petersburg, in Paris, in Berlin. These were not imperial ventures. They grew out of the medieval cabinets of curiosities, the original collections in the British Museum from Sloane, from Harley, and from Cotton that originally came together. These were not imperial collections. These are Enlightenment collections of all sorts of things, of medals, of coins, of stuffed animals, of maps, of, a vast array of stuff. It's absolutely true that these museums have lived through periods in which their countries have had imperial exploits. But if you look at the holdings in the British Museum, and I totaled this up recently, actually a very small percentage comes from lands where Britain once had imperial possessions. One of its most recent collections, which is the biggest collection of Korean artifacts in the world, but that doesn't come from any imperial heritage. That comes from collecting, from acquiring, from donations, from systematic building up of a museum. So I really don't... I don't buy into the idea that museums are de facto imperialist. I think that's a shorthand that we now use, and it doesn't actually bear out the reality. There are, of course, some aspects of the museums, because they did live through imperial times, and there are some things museums should give back and should make recompense for. But I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I don't think that means that all museums should be condemned, as seems to be quite fashionable at the moment. But can I come back on one other point as well? Elgin was someone who arrived in 1801 in Athens, and the building that he found in front of him, well, actually it was his people, he came a couple of years later, but the people that he had personally paid to go and do drawings and plaster casts, they found a wrecked building. It's not that there was a pristine, integral building that Elgin systematically destroyed. It was a wrecked building. Half the sculpture had already gone. One half had gone. Most of that had gone in AD 500, when the Athenians themselves had turned it from a pagan temple of Athena into a church. And so, typical iconoclasm of the period, they destroyed the statuary. So that was domestic removal of the statuary, that wasn't Elgin. By the time he turned up in 1801, the Ottomans had taken Athens in 1456, so that's 345 years of Ottoman rule. And the Ottomans came from a culture where they didn't respect statuary or 3D imagery, so they didn't have much time for it. So they had turned the Parthenon, the Acropolis Hill, into a military base, and they were using the sculpture for target practice. They were shooting at it with firearms. They were grinding bits off to use them for lime. They were selling bits to tourists. So Elgin's original plan had been to pay, which he did, artists to do drawings and casts. But when he heard of the state that the building was in, his plan evolved into one of saving what he could. And so he took half of what was left. So a quarter of the original statuary is the Elgin Marbles, as it were. But he did not ruin the building. The building was already ruined. I just think it's important to note that, because when you go to the New Acropolis Museum, which is a beautiful museum, and I went there quite recently, there are gaps. And you will hear tour guides regularly telling people that's where the Elgin nicked the stuff. And that's simply not true, because the British Museum made casts with the New Acropolis Museum of everything the British Museum has. So the New Acropolis Museum has the most comprehensive array of marbles, of Parthenon sculptures that we have. The gaps are where they were destroyed before 1801. So I think Elgin actually was a conservator of art. He was not a vandal, and that's my view, but I think the facts bear that out.
Well, I think the facts don't bear that out at all. In fact, a lot of what you said is completely and utterly disputed. It is true that, of course, the building had been affected over a number of thousands of years, but there was still quite a lot there. And, of course, it was the end of the Ottoman Empire. So from then on, things could only, in theory, improve. And everyone knew that this is what was happening. And the Athenians did not want to see that happen. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that there was a lot of sort of negative feeling about this and protests. And it was not done with the acceptance of the Greeks who were there at the time. So that's the one thing to say. The other thing about nationalism and also the museums themselves, and I accept that museums have a very big role to play, and we should support them and all that sort of stuff. And I also accept that one shouldn't return everything. In fact, the Greeks are not asking for all the other stuff that is Greek in there to be returned. The one that they're asking for is to have those statues reunited with each other. Because the fact that there is so much here that has come from the temple, and there's still so much left in Greece as well, the other half, if you like, suggests that there was still a lot that had managed to survive thousands of years of various rulers coming into Athens. So the idea that Elgin was there because he was a lover, he wanted to preserve it rather than get himself perhaps some sort of accreditation for this amazing classical things that suddenly at that period, Great Britain really became very fond of, is just stretching history a bit too much.
I don't think there's any evidence for that at all.
Just a second.
It's a modern view.
In a second, I want to come to the chat. We have a new device where we can see what people are saying in the chat on the big screen. But first, I just want to see if we can get agreement on something between both sides of this side of the room. I thought that we were at a point where, were the marbles to be returned to Athens, you would have an opportunity in the New Acropolis Museum to see more of them together than you'd ever seen before. But are you saying, and can you agree, that in fact, because the museum has replicas of the sculptures that are now in London, you already see, as Dominic said, as much as you would if they were restored?
You can see some of the replicas, yes.
And how do they compare?
And
are they good replicas?
But yes, they're good replicas. And you can, they are positioned in a certain way, but you can imagine what it would be like if you actually had the real things reunited. We still have the old stuff, which is half all around it. So it's like saying, well, actually the British Museum can use 3D technology and have all these replicas here. So it doesn't need to have them here at all.
Right. And
on that basis.
Yeah. I'm really interested to know what people think about that. Technology, I submit, has changed everything. Let's go to the chat. Come on. And I think Louise... What's Louise? This one. Need my...
Yeah, we can see.
Right. OK, Louise, are you there? Or we just go with... OK. All right, we'll go with what she said. Given that... Louise. Love the lighting. Love the lighting. Nice to see you again. I'm supposed to look at this one. Given that modern tech, digitization of artifacts allows replicas already to exist in Athens, where would you rather they be in this argument? That the British Museum contents itself with replicas, or Athens?
Obviously Athens. I mean, really seriously, obviously Athens.
Wait. Let's make sure I understand this. You think Athens should stick with the replicas and the British
with the originals. I mean, even with the man's arguments about they were, whatever his name is, Elgin was protecting them. Fine, they go back now. They're in better condition than they would have been if they'd been up in the Parthenon for the last 100 years. But fine, they go back now. And I think it isn't just the Elgin marbles. It's all of it, because these museums can carry and have all the replicas, all this digital stuff, fantastic centers of learning, but have the originals in their original places. I was just thinking, perhaps you don't send the Rosetta Stone back to Rosetta, because I don't know whether there's anything there. So there are obviously edges where, it doesn't have to be as absolute as that, but it doesn't, it's, the Luxor obelisk and the Place de la Concorde should go back to Luxor. Has anyone been to Luxor? Look what it looks like with one obelisk up and nothing on the other half. It's so blindingly obvious with the technology that we have now and global travel. albeit that we have to stop traveling quite so much because of climate change. But I just think it's a fantastic opportunity to re-people the original sites with their sculptures. And again, as I also put in the chat, the Hyperstyle Hall in Karnak, it's so empty and bare. Why not put copies of the originals back in places like that? So you bring these places back to life. We have such opportunity here. And where did, you know, the originals should be where the originals came from, but you know, you can have copies all over the world.
Thank you, Louise. And while we are in the chat universe, can we come either now or in a minute to Lillian, who's saying there's a big problem with trying to turn the clock back, and I'd be keen to know what you mean by that, whether you worry that that's what we're advocating. Can we go to Lillian on that?
I'm here.
Excellent.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
I've turned my camera on. So yeah, I think this is one of those things where it's very difficult to know at what stage and under what circumstances. And clearly, it's a matter of the zeitgeist as it is at present. Sort of, this is how we feel at the moment. But the question is, you know, do you say that something that was taken 50 years ago should go back? Should something that was taken 100 years ago go back? At what stage do objects that don't have, for example, a religious significance, because that is slightly different. At what stage do objects that don't have a religious significance, or things like human remains, become, as it were, world property, property of cultures? And I think this is the argument about the Enlightenment and the original founding of the British Museum, which my understanding is it was very much about learning from people all around the world and learning about other cultures. It's a very Enlightenment thing. So I think if we're going down this route, and then it can be quite a dangerous one, because if you start applying it, for example, to politics or national boundaries in the same way, then you get into an awful mess. So I think there is an issue about, does this mean that we have actually reached post-Enlightenment? But I do think that that part of the answer then is what everybody's been saying about holograms and representations. So yeah, I think the important thing is to keep studying other cultures.
Thanks, Lillian. And there is an argument, isn't there, I think made by someone at Stanford or the Met, that simply by virtue of the length of time that these sculptures have been in the British Museum's collection, they have sort of osmosed into part of British as opposed to Greek culture. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that, but Errol, I want to put both those two things to you. Is there any credence, do you think, in that argument that if you have something long enough, it becomes part of your culture? I suppose the argument would be that this is a cosmopolitan culture. And secondly, that this was, as Dominic was saying, part of an enlightened rather than a nationalistic culture grab.
Well, one may criticise the Enlightenment itself, actually, and the cultural superiority that's assumed in that idea in relation to the rest of the world. And also, going back to this idea, you know, the British Museum likes to style itself as the world collection or the world museum. This assumption that these Western museums have this kind of encyclopedic responsibility is colonial arrogance. No, they don't have the responsibility to tell or to acquire or to keep the culture of the world, or to even try to save it. You know, that is what I was saying about this nationalistic idea and this imperial idea. Is the imperial idea is not just expressed in where the objects comes from, but this idea, this assumption that somehow the British Museum it has the responsibility to tell the story of the culture of the world. It does not. And that's what's being challenged at the moment. Right. You know, so the time frame doesn't matter. 100 years doesn't make it right. We've got the debate. There's other controversies with the British Museum, with the Benin bronzes. That's well over 100 years. It's the result of the most appalling military atrocity that was perpetrated on the people. And the passage of 100 years does not heal that wound. They should be returned. The Benin bronzes should go back. So this is a whole movement of questioning the means by which these objects were acquired and displayed, and the ideas behind it, the Enlightenment, the idea of the encyclopedic museum. That is colonial arrogance in itself. You know, without the possession of the object, the idea of, you know, so what I was trying to say to Dominic, you know, the V&A, these sorts of museums, Albertopolis, you know, all of that, that expresses this colonial acquisitiveness, you know, to acquire culture, to interpret it, to show it. It's arrogant, and that's what's being challenged.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's really exciting, apart from anything else, that the historical part of this argument, you know, the circumstances of the acquisition is not a sterile, you know, compartmentalizable part of this argument. It's really live, isn't it? And I'm also interested at the other end of the story, that if you make a movie of this, there are scenes, and I want to get onto this before we run out of time, that would have to concern the corridors of power right now, about the balance of power between government and trustees and passing the buck and all that kind of stuff. But Liz, can I come to you in a second? Paul, you made the mistake before we started of showing your hand on this. Do you still, are you still where you were at 6:15 on this?
I am in total agreement with Dominic.
Why?
Majorly because of an exhibition at the British Museum in 2004. And obviously the questions were being raised in 2003, so the British Museum staged an Elgin exhibition and tracked you through through the history of everything that was going on.
Right.
And how they became acquired, why they were there, and everything else, and with documentation. Now, I've seen nothing to disprove that documentation since then. But I think the other thing...
So wait, just to be clear, you were persuaded by the explanations that the museum had title, sort of legitimate ownership of the...
Well, yeah, I mean, whether you take it from the Sultan or whether you take it, it was clearly a relic. You know, it had been blown up in the war, it had been completely devastated, it was stones scattered everywhere. And I don't think that can be in dispute. I don't think that can be in dispute.
We'll come to you in a second.
But you know, for me, the fact that they hang, and it was an interesting point that we've now got copies in Greece, which will allow people to see it. It'll be a much smaller number than would be able to see it in the British Museum. Obviously, we have 6 million visitors. They have 1.6. We don't charge. They do. But ultimately, they're on display. And what is in the British Museum is part of the narrative of the collection of the British Museum. Now, whether you agree or disagree with it, to me, then becomes moot. But the reality is that they are part of that heritage collection that we, as Britain, has collected over its time, right, and displayed and saved. And some people argue without that intervention, they wouldn't exist anyway.
Okay, Paul, thanks very much. There's a lot of head shaking behind you.
Thanks, Paul. Just a little, Dominic, you gave the game away when you referred to the Bayeux tapestry. That is English imperialism.
I should have asked, can you say your name before you...
My name's Dennis McShane. That is English imperialism. In France, it's called Le Tapis de Mathilde, Queen Matilda's tapestry. It was not done in England. It was done in Bayeux. She was the wife of the Duke of Normandy. That was the centre of his power. She never went to England. It's the most marvellous thing. And I think if it had been ripped off the church walls and installed in some British museum somewhere in Britain, we'd probably still be at war with France ever since. Now, the Greeks can't go to war with us because we had a giant navy controlling the Mediterranean at the time. Elgin was a syphilitic, corrupt, his nose was dropping off, that was his main problem, who came and wanted to leave a mark. He didn't take them down. The Parthenon has been standing for 2,500 years, as have the other great temples of antiquity, representing democracy, culture, just about everything we now live by. He came and he didn't take off bits of sculpture lying around the ground. He hired men with axes, with pickaxes, with hammers. If he'd had a JCB at the time, he probably would have used that. He put them all in a ship, brought them home. They weren't enough to pay off his debts and his mistresses. So he's tried to sell them to the government. The House of Commons had a huge debate and said these are acquired illegally. There's not a single document of proof of ownership. They're what the Germans call Raubkunst. And you might as well say the Hermann Goering Memorial Museum should hang on to all the art he stole because they required it by force majeure. It is a shame to Britain that we're hanging on to this. The marbles were taken out and in the 1930s were cleaned with workmen with wire scrubbers, a wire brush, and Brillo pads, not Andrew Neil, just ordinary old-fashioned Brillo. And they now sort of sit there gleaming white, not as they would have been on the Parthenon. The Ottomans respected. Go to Ephesus, they didn't knock that down. Go to Constantinople, it's full of Roman and pre-Christian, pre-Ottoman art. They weren't vandals at all. That is, again, utter British racist imperialism about the way Muslims handle art. So I think the answer is very, very simple. It's not the models that are there now. There are now methods of making absolute identical copies. That I fully accept. Good. Let us keep those copies in London and let the originals go back to where they belong. What belongs together should come together. But you've got a Prime Minister who is the biggest English nationalist we've had in 300 years. You have a chairman of the Board of Trustees of the British Museum, one George Osborne, who's not got the slightest interest in culture other than Wagner. He's a great Wagner fan. He goes to Bayreuth. He understands Wagnerian culture. He's not for a second going to vote to allow, in the name of the British Museum. It requires, yes, a decision. I discussed it with George a couple of months ago. He said, oh, Tony Blair should have done it at the beginning when he became Prime Minister.
I have a feeling there was a story there. I was looking at the iPad. Can you just repeat what you just said about George and Tony?
I was chatting to George at a book launch a couple of months ago. I used to be a minister, an MP, and he said, oh, Blair should have done all that at the beginning. It would have been easy to do when Blair came in. Well, I actually discussed... As in restore? No, we'll take the decision, yes, to send them back. Very easy for George to pass the buck. Well, you always know a politician. They either say it'll all happen in the future or it all should have happened before in the past. But when you say, what about here and today? Well, look, let's have a drink and talk about it, Dennis. Now, I did talk to Chris Smith, who was then the Culture Secretary, great guy, good friend. And I said, Chris, we really are... So you talk about Christopher Hitchens, he's one of my closest friends. And when he says it's dreadful that they're in a country where they drink whiskey, I've never seen Christopher close to the Parthenon in the Plaka looking up without at least half a litre of ouzo on one side and about 3 litres of Retsina on the other. So Christopher shouldn't pretend somehow the Greeks are all sort of Alcoholics Anonymous and don't drink as they enjoy their art. But I talked to Chris Smith about it. This is a story, you're quite right. I said, Chris, why the hell don't we give them back? He said, for God's sake, Dennis, please, don't mention that. Don't mention that. He was a Secretary of State for Culture. He walked in mortal fear of the British establishment, the museum establishment, the Imperial Museum establishment. Macron's ordered the restitution of Benin bronzes from Paris to where they belong in Africa. We're still resisting. And this is about a much bigger power play, and we're not going to get it under this government, this Prime Minister, and I wouldn't, frankly, as a loyal Labour guy, hold out a lot of hopes for a Labour government, a Liberal Democratic government, or even if Scotland breaks away from England, and they won't be able to send them back either.
But sorry, just to be clear, Chris Smith was in fear of the British establishment changing its mind and him therefore being in a position of having to approve the return of the marbles?
No, he didn't want me to raise it politically and publicly as a noisy MP writing articles lobbying Blair about it.
If I remember correctly, Chris Smith said straight away that we're not returning them. Just a little while after, when of course the Labour government Blair won. When, in fact, Parliament seemed to have been voting for them, or quite a lot of MPs had already voted to send them back, or at least had signed whatever it was that had happened. And Chris Smith just sent it all back, set it all back by a good few decades. And here we are. And we could have been discussing what we're discussing now back in 1997. Instead, we're discussing it now. But of course, one of the difference would have been and was that we didn't have the technology at that time to be able to have the type of discussion we're having right now. So I think things have moved. There is absolutely that. The other thing that has moved is that Greece has also changed. It has the museum, which it didn't have at the time, which is now known as a great place to exhibit anything to do with the Parthenon and the Acropolis. And of course, Greece is also on the path now. I mean, there had been all these concerns during this whole debate that Greece was, basically a failed state and the economy was doing badly, so you refer to the fact that I'm an economist. And that was used actually as a reason for not returning. How can we trust them? They haven't got the ability to, keep them and all that sort of stuff. Well, all that's gone. Greece is in the EU. It gets huge support right now. It's the fastest growing economy actually in the EU. And just one little thing about the way that the whole thing was constructed. As a Greek, of course, and it was growing up there, you pass it and it's still there. You can see, I mean, it just dominates the city, but you're so used to it. But saying that it's not part of our culture is a crazy thing to say. It is part of the Greek culture, even though people say, well, you Greeks, you've all been mixed with everything else. Are you really descendants of those Greeks? Well, I don't know. Well, you can say the same for any British person you meet. I mean, they come from all sorts of different cultures themselves. But the whole thing was built as an infrastructure project. I mean, just thinking of you mentioning George Osborne and others. It was basically Athens was going through a bit of a bad period, and Pericles decided that the thing to do was have this building thing. And I was doing this debate, and somebody said, well, it was so, what's the point? Why do you want to preserve anything? All these things were built by slaves. And of course, he couldn't be more wrong. It was done, all the Athenians took part. It was done by a couple of architects designed it. There were sculptors in Greece, in Athens. There were sculptors coming from elsewhere. Every Athenian was paid 1 drachma a day for working on it. So it was done. And the sculptors 2 drachmas a day, coming from various islands and so on. So it isn't just the sculptures that are amazing. It is the way it was done. And we're now talking about HS2 taking, I don't know how many decades. This was done in 7, 8, 9 years. I mean, no time at all. With
Let me just, before we run out of time, I have promised we'll come back to you, Dominic. Liz, did you still want, can we go to Liz, then Dominic? And if possible, I want to come to Alistair Eglinton later, mentioning the Terracotta Army in the chat. Liz.
Thanks. I hope this is okay to say.
Yeah, it is, I can tell you.
But I agree with everyone. It's really annoying, I know, in a ThinkIn. Everybody's right. What I mean by that is in lockdown, you make your list with your kids of the fun things you're going to do when lockdown is finished. And in my house, number 1 was go to the Coral Reef in Bracknell, ride the water slides. Number 2 was go to the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. Was that the one with the Maasai people? Yeah. And so... and it's really fun if you've ever been, we live near Oxford, you go, there's natural history museums at the front and you see the dinosaurs and the big crab and the glowing stones, it's cool. And then there's the sort of Pitt Rivers is at the back, a big dark room full of all these extraordinary objects. And we've always enjoyed going there as a family. And I went 2 weekends ago, we finally went. I've got an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old. And I was very struck by the changes in the museum. The display that had the human remains in it, it was at the front, they're not there anymore, and they've done a wrap around it to sort of talk about that process and what have you. They've done a thing on the left here about acknowledging the women who were part of the collection, and there's a they'd done an overlay, that's probably not the right word, of a young curator had come in and put new modern things in with the old things. that sort of talk about LGBT people over time across the world, sort of drawing out new stories. And they sort of had a go, was my best way of describing it, at sort of communicating a way of looking at the museum that really was not there the last time I went, which might only have been 4 years ago, probably. Think about the people who are being represented, think about the way that the objects are displayed. But most of the objects are still displayed in the same way that they were before. And I suppose the reason why I'm saying I sort of agree with everybody is, with my kids, that new sort of version of the Pit Rivers, and I'm sure it's evolving, meant that we were able to have conversations that we would never have had before about the context and about the meaning, about those sorts of things. So that's one thing about history being very alive. Like we've said, it's changing and really interesting and moving. And then the other thing, although I think Errol's absolutely right about the magical technology thing that could go in that space in the British Museum would be mind-blowing and amazing. And on balance, I'm on the side of send them back, just for the record. But there's something about, I've lost my thread. The sort of, there's something magical about it being the actual thing. And my little people sort of staring in at the funny little silver bottle that says it's got a witch inside. If that was a replica of a bottle that said it just wouldn't communicate in the same way. So, you know, the Pit Rivers is still, now we can feel it, deeply problematic. There's tons of stuff in there that I came away thinking, oh my good grief, you know, and I really didn't used to have that response to it until this time. So there's something about trying to render in these spaces that feeling of discomfort, that if the things weren't there, would the discomfort not be there either? Do you know what I mean?
No, I hear you on the power of the real thing. Of course, if the real thing were in the real place, it would still have that power, wouldn't it? Or
it would, I suppose. Then,
or are you saying that
the learning for us coming to terms with the reality of the history, my kids then wouldn't necessarily have that experience. Do you know what I mean? And maybe it's a sort of transitional thing, and that we're going through a process. And but I think that the fact that museums can change, I think, is magical and brilliant, and they should.
Yeah, thank you. Dominic, and before we run out of time, I want to give all you three a chance to address the simple question of what you think will actually happen, given that for the past sort of 20, 30 years, we've had a government that says it's up to the museum trustees, and a bunch of trustees who are appointed by the government but and who say, we're bound by the rules of the museum and you'll have to have a change in law before we get rid of anything. But Dominic, you've heard quite a lot, and you want to come back.
Yeah, I just wanted to address, in fact, and that was one of the points. So under the British Museum and the Trustee Acts, the way it works is that the trustees of the British Museum are only allowed to deaccession an item if it's either a duplicate or it's not fit for display, it's broken in some way. And that is not the case with the Parthenon sculptures. So the only way they can be given back to Greece is by an Act of Parliament. To remove them from the trust, which is totally doable, of course. But the good gentleman here talking about George Osborne and so on, it's just not his decision, and that's the wrong place to look. So that was one point. The second one, there was a question about at the beginning, should they be the Elgin Marbles or the Parthenon sculptures? And that's a really, really fascinating question, because from the way I see it, actually they're both. And actually, Giles, that goes back to a question that you asked around, do objects become something else if they have another life, like the Nefertiti in Berlin, or, you know, many of these objects that have lived in other places. If they've acquired other sobriquets or other names, it's reflecting part of the journey of their life, because objects do have those journeys if they've been to other places. So I see nothing wrong in them being both simultaneously the Parthenon sculptures and the Elgin Marbles. That's just a recognition of the dichotomy that's, you know, inherent in these sculptures. And the final one, the question of technology, I think there's another aspect to this as well that's really important to think about. Hoa Hack, the lovely Easter Island statue in the British Museum. So that was given to Britain by the Easter Islanders. It wasn't taken or looted, it was given. It was put in the British Museum, where it acts as an incredible ambassador for its home country, for Easter Island. Millions and millions and millions of people see that every year in the British Museum. Not as a stolen object, but as something that was given to Britain. that saves a vast amount of carbon being dumped in the air by people jumping on a plane and going to Easter Island, you know, off the coast of South America, which is an unnecessary piece of travel in this day and age. So if we think about replicas, and I think they are an amazing thing, and I think they should be used more, the technology is extraordinary, and that's not really a part of this debate in a way, that's part about museums and culture and heritage in general. I think the fact that we don't have to travel so much, that we can see things virtually or in one place, is a good thing. And I would not be in favour of returning the Easter Island statue to Easter Island and forcing everyone to have to go there. I don't think that's a sensible thing to do in the current environment.
Thank you very much. The flag is up. We're technically out of time, but I cannot disallow you an opportunity. Errol, you've spoken about how things are changing. Are they changing enough for the marbles to go back to Greece within the next decade?
I wouldn't put a timescale on it. It's probably unlikely, that particular timescale. What I do see, though, is this incredible movement where the museums that are not under the statutes that Dominic referred to are making this movement. So we've had Jesus College, Cambridge, the Aberdeen and the University of Aberdeen getting involved in restitution. And I think that, and then the other European countries, Berlin, Paris, you know, there's been movement in New York. So increasingly, these national museums are going to become isolated. And I foresee that there will be a change in future, and it will be a change in law after we get through this moral shift about acquisitiveness and hanging on to things that you know. So, but going back to the Easter Island, the Rapa Nui people came to ask for it back. Didn't they? They
really want it back. Yeah.
There was a demonstration in the British Museum. But I think the naming thing as well, I want to refer to. I do think it's interesting, these terms. You know, whether we say Easter Island or Rapa Nui, or whether we say something is a sculpture or if it's a marble. I think there is a difference in that, and quite apart from we put somebody's name, Robert Bruce or Lord Elgin, in front of it, I think these things do matter about the status that we're giving to it. I mean, for me, marble reminds me of little things that we play with as children. You know, these are monumental sculptures. You know, they shouldn't be referred to as marbles. So, but yeah, I think it's shifting, and the national museums are going to hold out until the very last moment before they do something. But I think they will eventually.
Thank you. And just finally, Jackie. Vicky, excuse me. What did I call you, Jackie? Has that happened before?
Oh, constantly.
Yeah. So one argument that crops up sometimes within this debate is, oh, it's not worth it. We've got more to worry about. We've got the Third World War in Ukraine. We've got the cost of living crisis. It's not that important, you know, for a new Act of Parliament, for example. But my sense is that if you come from Greece, it's a lot more important. Is that the case?
It is important for the Greeks right now, very important, but also, I mean, just imagine, I know how people will look again at Boris Johnson as a true European if he gives them back. I mean, right now, the relationship with Europe is appalling, and it could improve. So there's one chance that he's got to do that. So, and popular view is changing, and I think that is important. And I do agree. I think in the meantime, there is something else you can do, of course, until we get to the wonderful point that we've just been discussing, which is you can lend them, you can do joint things a lot more, you can be seen to be moving towards that position of finally getting them back. But also I think there is a role, a bit like we have World Trade Organization rules, etc., etc. You can have rules as to what is it that national museums, or museums generally, are expected to do, given that the environment has now changed, and what, how do you decide which bits? We're not talking about everything going back, but what is the process through which you finally end up with the national museums not being able to say no, and certainly the governments, therefore, not being able to say no, because there is an internationally accepted way of behaving which you have to abide by.
Thank you so much. There's some distance between where we are now and that, and I suspect that Boris Johnson is not too concerned at the moment about in polishing his credentials as a European. But look...
Well, he should be, of course.
Well,
it's a great party you can have.
Thank you all very much. I mean, very, very briefly, I think we all agreed that technology has changed everything. Really, really good replicas can create really, really good encyclopedic museum experiences. That there is a moral shift, as you put it, underway, and I was I thought I knew where I stood on this, but I have been forced to think in more depth about the difference between an encyclopedic, an Enlightenment, or a nationalistic museum, and what the one down the road qualifies as now, and what would be left if it sort of conceded to the pressures that seem to be building. Anyway, I'm sure that we will have this debate again before those marbles leave, but my sense is that they will in the end. And I'm glad that we have been able to disagree in a civilized way about all that. Thanks all very much.